Hello, and welcome to Top Story Daily Edition. I'm JNS Editor-in-Chief Jonathan Tobin. Thanks for joining me for another discussion on the most pressing issues in the Jewish world. Please like, subscribe, and give us good reviews when you listen to the show. Now let's get started. The aftermath of the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel was a wake-up call for a lot of Jewish liberals. It's not just that they, along with the rest of the world, were shocked by the depravity of the terrorist assault, which left more than 1,300 Israelis dead, thousands wounded, and approximately 150 believed to have been kidnapped and taken to Gaza. The appalling evidence of rapes and mass killings of men, women, and children, including the burning and beheading of infants, almost beyond comprehension. But for political progressives, the fact that some of their allies on the left were cheering for Hamas was a bridge too far even for those who have always preferred to see no enemies on the left. The existence of a pro-Hamas wing of the progressive movement is a stain on the honor of the political left that shouldn't be ignored or downplayed. It illustrates not just the indecency of those taking this stand, but demonstrates the consequences of the rise of toxic ideologies like intersectionality and critical race theory, in which Jews and Israelis are mischaracterized, by definition, white oppressors of Palestinian people of color. Conservatives, who have been pointing out that woke ideas like the diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI catechism enable anti-Semitism, already had plenty of proof to back up their conclusions. But the spectacle of pro-Hamas activism in American streets, and especially on the campuses of elite universities like Harvard and Columbia, which has led directly to threats and acts of violence against Jews, has established beyond any doubt the intersectional left's embrace of a form of Jew hatred that is indistinguishable from that of the Nazis. Yet, as outraged as I am about the moral bankruptcy of these progressives, I don't view them as the primary threat to Israel in the West. Just now, I'm far more worried about the behavior and comments of decent liberals than their more radical erstwhile allies. By that, I mean those figures who have expressed their revulsion at Hamas's actions and denounced the support the terrorists have gotten from the progressives, but who, unlike President Joe Biden, don't add a full stop to their support of Israel. The loud chorus of corporate media, talking heads, and pundits, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who are treating Israel's efforts to put an end to this deadly threat as morally dubious, may not be as despicable as those openly approving of the mass killing of Jews. However, it is those avatars of a decent left that treat the Israeli counteroffensive aimed at hopefully eliminating Hamas as also wrong, who wield far more influence and do a great deal more damage to the existential struggle to defend the Jewish state than the ones who react to images of murdered Jewish babies with cries of Free Palestine. Those supposedly good people don't merely virtue signal their anguish about Palestinian casualties as well as those of Israelis. Instead, they assert a degree of moral equivalence between the efforts of the Israel Defense Forces to take out terrorists and the crimes of Hamas. They denigrate advocacy for the complete defeat of Hamas as not merely futile, but wrong, since they claim that the taking of life on both sides should be denounced regardless of the circumstances. It is hard to ignore the mobs in New York's Times Square howling for the shedding of Jewish blood, yet it is unlikely that anyone in the Biden administration, even those mid-level staffers most hostile to Israel, is paying much attention to them. But the op-ed columnist, working at the New York Times, just a few blocks away, right now writing pieces urging opposition to Israel's counteroffensive and calling for international pressure on the Jewish state that will essentially leave the murderers in place and triumphant when the shooting stops, are the real problem. And the statements and social media posts from the Black Lives Matter movement noting their approval of the attacks, including one in which they invoke the paragliders used to perpetrate the massacre at a rave festival in which hundreds were slaughtered and women were raped next to the corpses of their friends, was particularly egregious. So too were the demonstrations held by leftist groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, where Hamas was applauded, as well as gatherings around the country where Arab and Palestinian Americans took a prominent role in both identifying with Hamas and falsely labeling their bestial acts as justified resistance against Israeli occupation. Most of the liberal establishment had, of course, endorsed the BLM movement in 2020 in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. But when the Zionist Organization of America National President Mort Klein denounced BLM for its open anti-Zionism, he was denounced by many on the Jewish left as a racist for having the bad manners to tell the truth about a group that was treated as irreproachable by those desperate to stay in sync with liberal political fashion. Still, no one on the Jewish left could be surprised that many of their allies were anti-Zionists. But the fact that they had no scruples or reticence about publicly embracing not just violence against Israel, but atrocities of this sort, had to hurt. After all, rather than dispute the atrocities, the Hamas perpetrators were proud of them, posting the images of their murderous spree and abuse of women on social media, and then were cheered in the streets of Gaza. The identification with these crimes even shocked some on the left. Congressional Squad leader Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez felt the need to disassociate herself from what she rightly described as the bigotry and callousness on display at the Times Square DSA pep rally for Hamas. Yet in the same statement, she asserted a moral equivalence between Israeli victims and Palestinian terrorists and their supporters, and called for a ceasefire that would allow the Islamist group to escape punishment for its crimes. AOC's pivot away from open support for Hamas, a stance that separated her from other Squad colleagues such as Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, proved telling. The opportunistic AOC understood instinctively that the place for critics of Israel to be was not among the ranks cheering the slaughter of Jews, but rather among those seeking to stop Israel from preventing future terrorist attacks. The foreign policy establishment had already begun to weigh in to deprecate any Israeli action that might take down Hamas, as pieces by Richard Haas and Thomas Friedman indicated. They were soon joined by other Times columnists like Nicholas Kristof and Michelle Goldberg, who were careful to denounce Hamas atrocities, but swiftly moved on to their real objective, establishing that Israel's counterattack was, in principle as well as practice, bound to be as wrong as the terrorist massacre. None were more clear about this than Washington Post columnist Paul Waldman, an influential figure inside the Beltway who, like Haas, Friedman, and Goldberg, is Jewish. Waldman's piece, titled Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Needs Moral Consistency, Not Moral Clarity, got to the heart of the debate that will determine whether the Biden administration will stick to its praiseworthy stance supporting Israel or abandon it in the coming days once an Israeli offensive comes under fire from those who will cite Palestinian casualties as a reason to let Hamas off the hook. Waldman thinks the effort to draw a clear moral distinction between Hamas crimes and Israeli efforts to prevent future crimes and to punish the perpetrators is wrong. Indeed, in a gobsmackingly outrageous argument, he claims that if you see Hamas as absolutely in the wrong and Israel as being in the right, then you are no different from Hamas. That makes sense if, like those who peddle the foreign policy establishment's failed ideas about the only solution to the conflict being territorial compromise, you see the Palestinian efforts to destroy Israel as not that dissimilar from Israel's unwillingness to be destroyed. What he wants is more nuance, in which our grief for Palestinian civilian casualties is balanced against our tears for Israelis who have been murdered, raped, or kidnapped. He believes that if one is justified, so is the other. It's true that we should deplore the suffering of all innocents. But the problem with this is not just his insufferable virtue sin. Rather, it is his unwillingness to understand that a cause that cheers the most depraved atrocities is immoral, and one that seeks to defeat and completely destroy the group and the ideology that produces these crimes is, by definition, moral, even if sometimes the pursuit of that just end may require military action that results in the deaths of civilians. Just as the military campaigns of the Allies against the Nazis during World War II necessitated an unfortunate toll of German civilian dead, so too must those of Israel to wipe out Hamas, even if its army does far more to avoid such death than any other. Some historians continue to debate the morality of some of the air raids on Germany. But can anyone seriously doubt that a moral scrupulousness about violating the laws of war that allowed the Nazi regime to survive in Berlin so as to lessen the total of German civilian casualties would have been profoundly immoral? The evidence of Hamas beliefs that was on display during the October 7th attacks was the worst massacre of the Jews since the Holocaust compels the observer to conclude that the Islamist group is not merely dedicated to Israel's destruction, but is at its core as genocidal and barbaric as the Nazis. That means that those who argue that Israel must stand down and allow Hamas to survive as the sovereign power in the Gaza Strip are advocating a stance that is not just pro-terrorist, but immoral. In wars like these, responsibility for the deaths that occur belongs to those who pursue immoral ends, not their opponents. The campaign to completely eliminate Hamas is, from both a legal and a moral perspective, a just war. To oppose such a war in the name of a dubious moral consistency about abhorring civilian casualties isn't merely specious. Those who take this position want us to think that they are decent liberals and morally distinct from progressives who glory in Hamas crimes. But those opinion leaders who are pushing hard for the Biden administration to use its leverage to stop Israel from defeating Hamas are actually far worse than the leftists who aren't afraid to express their anti-Semitism in public. The rantings of the hard left are upsetting and create an atmosphere of hate that makes Jewish life more difficult on campuses and in cities. But the decent liberals, who may well prove to be the lifeline of the criminals who shed Jewish blood in such great quantities this past week, may do a great deal more harm than those radicals in the long run. If they succeed in persuading Biden to back away from Israel and let Hamas win, those supposedly virtuous people who are so convinced of their goodness will have the blood of all the future victims of Islamist terrorism, both Jewish and non-Jewish, on their hands. Thanks for listening. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition and every week for the full hour-long JNS TV program. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself.